The Yin and Yang of HIV by Dr Valendar Turner and Andrew McIntyre. Part 3. When put to the test, conventional HIV/AIDS theory is at odds with the clinical evidence. Is purified HIV no more than a tangle of cellular debris? Discovery consists of seeing what everyone has seen and thinking what nobody has thought.
If one goes through all the HIV literature which exists to date, I think one will find it bold and incredible to still believe that there is proof for the existence of HIV. When a particle looks like a retrovirus, you have to isolate it, then put it in another culture, show that the cells in the secondary culture produce particles exactly like the particles from which they originated. That the two particles from the two cultures are exactly the same can be shown only by determining their constituent proteins and RNA. So isolation is extremely important to prove that a particle is a retrovirus.
The diagnosis of HIV infection. What proof is there for the existence of HIV? Scientific evidence for the existence of a retrovirus must be consistent with the definition of a retrovirus as a particular kind of replicating microscopic particle. Thus, researchers must demonstrate the correct size, shape, and construction of particles, that these particles have been purified and analysed and contain RNA as well as an enzyme, reverse transcriptase, that makes DNA from RNA, and that the particles are infectious. That is, when pure particles are introduced into fresh cell cultures, identical progeny appear. The latter necessitates a second round of purification and analysis. Indeed, although this method is entirely logical and was deemed essential at a meeting held at the Pasteur Institute in 1973, it has been ignored by all HIV researchers.
So Montagnier claimed to prove that he had particles, he had proteins which are not present in any other retrovirus. He purified the virus. But he did not publish any electron micrographs of the purified material to prove, you seeing is believing. And they claimed that they had purified material, but there were no electron micrographs. And this is one of the conditions where Barré-Sinoussi and Jean-Claude Charmaine put it in 1973. You must have picture of the purified virus and show that the material contains nothing else but particles with the same physical characteristics. But no such pictures were published.
Although there are electron microscope photographs from unpurified cell cultures of particles purported to be HIV particles, it was not until March 1997 that electron micrographs of purified HIV were published. Yet, such data is the first, most essential step in attempts to prove particles are a virus, and for subsequent extraction of constituents for analysis and use as diagnostic reagents. These long-awaited micrographs reveal purified HIV to be a tangle of cellular debris. Scattered amongst this are scant particles which, without evidence, the authors claim are the HIV particles and which co-purify with the cellular material.
I'm absolutely dismayed to find out that for about 15 years, the essential control of electron microscopy was neglected, completely neglected. And it's only very recently, about 2 years ago, that 2 papers came out in which finally electron microscopy was used to verify the presence of virus particles in samples which were for all these 15 years regarded as pure virus. And to my greatest dismay, these pictures were showing practically nothing else but cell debris.
Close examination of these particles, as well as other evidence in the papers, show they are too large, wrongly shaped, have too high a mass, and are devoid of knobs that HIV experts unanimously assert are absolutely essential for the HIV particle to cause infection. It is from this material that HIV/AIDS experts and biotechnology companies obtain proteins and RNA to use in tests to pronounce humans infected with a unique exogenous AIDS-causing microbe. On 17th of July 1997, the French investigative television journalist Jamel Tahi interviewed Professor Luc Montagnier on camera at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. Montagnier was asked, "Why do the electron micrograph photographs published by you come from the culture and not the purification?" His reply was, "There was so little production of virus it was impossible to see what might be in a concentrate of the virus from the gradient. There was not enough virus to do that. Of course one looked for it. One looked for it in the tissues at the start. Likewise the biopsy. We saw some particles, but they did not have the morphology typical of retroviruses."
It was startling that Professor Montagnier decided to acknowledge in his interview with Jamel Tahi and Continue that as far back as 1983, his team were not able to purify anything that you might call HIV, despite what he termed a Roman effort.
Questioned about the Gallo group, Montagnier replied, "Gallo? I don't know if he really purified. I don't believe so. This should have been both the beginning and the end of HIV." Retrovirus-like particles are virtually ubiquitous in biological material, including, for example, cell cultures, and the majority, if not all, human placentas.
In fact, the third problem with the virus, with the particle, is that they use umbilical cultured lymphocytes, which originate from placenta. In placenta, it was known in the 70s that they release virus-like particle and they have reverse transcriptase activity. So find them in this culture is no proof that they originated from Montagnier's patient.
However, as Gallo confirms, the majority of retrovirus-like particles are not retroviruses because they do not replicate. The HIV particle has been classified into 2 subfamilies and 3 genera of retroviruses. This is analogous to describing a new species of mammal as a human, a gorilla, and an orangutan. Besides the HIV particle, cell cultures contain other particles of numerous morphologies, whose origin and role are unknown. A long and detailed study from Harvard revealed the identical HIV particle in 18 out of 20, 90% of AIDS-related lymph node enlargements, but also in 13 out of 15, 88% of non-AIDS related enlargements. HIV experts claim to detect and even isolate HIV merely by demonstrating reverse transcription in cultures. However, although a property of retroviruses, reverse transcription is not, as many HIV/AIDS experts claim, unique to retroviruses or even viruses. Well before the AIDS era, Gallo himself showed that chemically stimulated normal lymphocytes possess this function.
The only way to say that the existence of reverse transcriptase or the detection of reverse transcriptase activity proves the retrovirus was there is only if reverse transcription was specific to retroviruses, which is not the case. In fact, today nearly everybody accepts that reverse transcription or reverse transcriptase activity is non-specific to retroviruses.
The HIV proteins and antibodies. Although both Montagnier and Gallo have never published electron micrographs to prove the presence of retrovirus-like particles in their pure virus, and Montagnier now concedes there weren't any, both groups and all others since claim such material as pure HIV. This claim is based on the fact that such material contains proteins which react with antibodies present in AIDS patients. However, such reasoning is untenable. Imagine a scientist who mixes 2 solutions together, obtains a precipitate, and then proclaims the identity and source of several reactants. One does not need a degree in chemistry to realize this is an impossibility. Nonetheless, because cultures and antibodies derived from AIDS patients react together, the proteins are declared to belong to HIV and the antibodies, the HIV-specific antibodies.
Nobody can find free infectious HIV virus in a human being. That is why they have to resort to looking for antibodies to HIV in a person. That is one of the biggest flaws in the HIV hypothesis.
In fact, Gallo admits that for him, an antibody test is the quintessence of HIV isolation. During an interview at the 1998 Geneva AIDS conference, he admitted,
"Sometimes we had Western blot positive where we couldn't isolate the virus. So we got worried and felt that we're getting false positives sometimes, so we added the Western blot." That's all I can tell you. It was an experimental tool when we added it, and for us, it worked well because we could isolate the virus when we did.
Actually, in 1984, Gallo's false positives sometimes were antibodies in 88% of AIDS patients, but virus isolated in 36% of AIDS patients. Gallo solved the twin dilemmas of the missing virus and gross non-specificity of the HIV antibodies by making the Western blot antibody test an integral part of virus isolation. However, an antibody test is not isolation of a virus. HIV proteins can only be defined by extracting them from particles purified and proven to be a unique retrovirus. Such material has never been shown to exist, and such extraction never reported. Notwithstanding, since the mid-1980s, HIV researchers claim that a culture which reacts with a monoclonal antibody to one of the HIV proteins, the P24 protein, is proof of isolation of HIV. Since to isolate a virus is to obtain infectious particles separate from everything else, it is particularly difficult to see how so many scientists persevere in referring to a chemical reaction in this manner.
Now, the word isolation means to obtain something or to place something apart or to obtain a substance separate from everything else. Apparently, Montagnier by isolation did not mean this, but something totally different.
The origin of the HIV proteins. According to Eleopulos and her colleagues, all data presented to date are consistent with the HIV proteins being cellular. Using HIV antibodies as probes, HIV proteins have been identified in the tissues of persistently HIV-negative, healthy individuals, including in blood platelet and skin cells, thymus, tonsil, and brain. As a mark of the bewildering status of the HIV theory, while HIV proteins could not be found in the placentas of 75 HIV-positive pregnant women, they could be found in the placentas of 25 healthy HIV-negative women.
If there is such a thing as an AIDS-causing retrovirus, then its unique body parts, that is its proteins, should only be found in HIV-positive individuals and individuals who have AIDS. But this is not the case. All the principal HIV proteins have been found in all manner of cells from healthy human beings who are HIV negative.
The HIV genome. As is the case with HIV proteins, the RNA purported to be the HIV genome has not been obtained from particles purified and proven infectious, but from the conglomerate material described above. Molecular biologists have produced possibly more information about the HIV genome than any other object in the universe. Nonetheless, there are no reports of even one individual possessing a complete, full-length HIV genome, and there is no agreement as to how many genes HIV possesses. Opinions have varied from 4 through to 8, 9 or 10. Human DNA and chimpanzee DNA differ by less than 2%, but variation in the composition of the HIV genome measures between 3% and 40%.
We have studied retroviruses, but HIV in particular has never been clearly defined in terms of its genetic structure and its molecular structure. And what I mean by that is that you can try to determine the genetic sequence of HIV from one person and compare it to another person, or even different viruses in the same person's body, and you'll find that there are huge variations in their genetic sequences. And now we're starting to talk about different strains and mutations and all this stuff. What that really means is that nobody's really sure exactly what HIV is, what the exact genetic sequence is.
Given that the DNA sequence determines the composition of a virus's proteins, and the latter, the physical, biochemical, and biological properties of a virus, how is it possible for such variation to represent one and the same agent? For example, how is it possible that HIV can induce the same antibodies, which can be recognized in a universal antibody test containing the identical proteins? Since, as the molecular biologist Duesberg reminds us, there is a range, a small range, in which you can mutate around without too much penalty, but as soon as you exceed it, you are gone and you are not HIV any longer, or a human any longer. Then you are either dead or you are a monkey, or what have you. It is evident that whatever the HIV DNA genome represents, it cannot be a virus. If there exists certain RNA which is unique to a retrovirus HIV, then finding such RNA should prove infection. However, the concordance between antibody and genetic tests varies between 40% to 100%, and HIV RNA can be found in individuals not infected with HIV. In responding to this scientific dilemma, the HIV experts have proclaimed that plasma viral load HIV RNA assays are designed for monitoring the effectiveness of antiretroviral therapies and for measuring the quantity of virus in patients with confirmed HIV infection, not for the diagnosis of HIV infection. Their performance in patients who are not infected with HIV is unknown, and their use leads to misdiagnosis of HIV infection. One manufacturer of PCR states that the AmpliCore HIV-1 monitor test is not intended to be used as a screening test for HIV or as a diagnostic test to confirm the presence of HIV infection.
And he was using Kermali's PCR technique, which is a multiplication technique, not a quantification technique, by the way, and multiply molecules into its millions and equal those molecules with the virus, right? Absolutely ridiculous. Even more, as those sequences he's going to multiply and equal them with the virus, that's the viral load, are present in everybody. It's just a way to save face for the whole AIDS industry, because more and more people are aware that this could not be, you know, because inside the AIDS scene there are a lot of critical medical doctors, but they saw such a lot of contradiction, and it was discussed on conferences. So there was high noon for a new medal and a new test where the pharmaceutical companies could make a great business out of it.
These being the case, the specificity of plasma viral load is unknown, and it is difficult, if not impossible, to claim that HIV RNA is the unique constituent of a specific retrovirus. How can one even consider using such tests to monitor or diagnose a supposedly deadly virus when the viral load obtained varies between 0 and 1 million copies on the same sample, depending on which technique or strain of HIV is involved? Lessons from the past. The evidence for the existence of Gallo's first human retrovirus, HL23V, was much stronger than for HIV. However, in 1980, the antibodies to the HL23V proteins were shown to occur following a large variety of common non-infectious factors, and in far more humans than could ever have developed leukemia. Thus, from signifying that an infectious mode of transmission of leukemia remains a real possibility in humans, and infection with an oncovirus retrovirus may be extremely widespread, the first human retrovirus abruptly disappeared from the annals of science. At present, no one, not even Gallo, believes it existed. However, had it not been for the efforts of the two research groups at the National Cancer Institute and Sloan Kettering, there was the distinct possibility that by now the world would be facing a pandemic of HL23V disease. In the AIDS era, experts recognise that antibodies to the HIV-specific proteins occur where there is no HIV, and in many more individuals than will ever develop AIDS. On what basis then does HIV still exist?
Every single prediction of the HIV theory has failed.
The dissident case, politics and public health policy.
It was first suggested that a retrovirus, HIV, was, and I quote, the probable cause of AIDS at a US government press conference in 1984. Since then, it's been generally accepted that AIDS is an infectious disease transmitted through blood and sex. If, however, as these scientists maintain, AIDS is not an infectious, sexually transmitted disease, then AIDS research has been wrongly directed for 15 years.
The failures of the past 15 years are fairly and squarely affixed to the 5 Montagnier and Gallo 1983-1984 science papers. That the titles of 3 of these papers contain the word isolation, and yet no evidence was presented, must stand as a memorial to the demise of editorial integrity. The dissident cases that HIV does not exist, Eleopulos, or if it does exist, it does not cause AIDS, Eleopulos and Duisberg, ultimately imply there will be devastating outcomes in terms of scientific credibility, including the failure of peer review, the demise of reputations of many experts and non-experts, the challenge to citizens' trust in governmental, scientific and medical leaders, as well as an uncertain period for the medical profession as a whole. Weaving a just resolution through this maze of socio-medico-legal bedlam will require the utmost tenacity from political leaders. Perhaps there are already signs of quiet beginnings, with the Americans' 1994 return of the discovery of HIV to the French, followed by Montagnier's admissions in his 1997 interview. Exceptionalism. Over and above all the uncertainties surrounding the HIV/AIDS debate, AIDS science medicine must stand as the most remarkable case of exceptionalism in history. The funding it attracts far outstrips that justified by its prevalence and economic impact. For example, over the past 17 years, Australia has a cumulative total of 7,766 AIDS cases, including 5,575 deaths. The big spenders are, in order, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Germany and Italy. Their combined annual HIV/AIDS research budget amounts to US $1.8 billion for a cumulative total of 761,572 AIDS patients, many of whom are dead. Of an additional US $20 million spent by the European Union in 1994 to 1998, most money goes to support travel and meeting costs rather than laboratory research.
There is a most urgent need to redirect research funding. Funds should go to laboratories working on other IDs totally independent from HIV and no longer restricted to laboratories working on a hypothesis which has never been proven.
While thousands of dollars per patient are spent on HIV/AIDS research, only a few dollars are spent on heart disease, cancer, mental illness, suicide prevention or road trauma. The funding paradox reaches epidemic, almost farcical proportions in developing countries, where Western AIDS workers spend their days dispensing advice and condoms to a population dying for want of pure water, adequate sanitation and nutrition, and antibacterial, antitubercular and anti-malarial medicines. In a word, dying of poverty.
Why have we done nothing for African people, just like give them clean water so they don't die in infancy of diarrheal disease and stuff like this? All we care about is HIV/AIDS. Well, question. Well, there's money in it. There has to be, other dynamic working to lead public interest to the African situation and ignore clean water, sanitation, malaria. Things that kill people.
In 2000, the annual cost of anti-HIV drugs for one person is about US $15,000. Greater than the entire health budget for many a third world village. With 650,000 to 900,000 HIV positive patients in the US as of July 1996, it would take US $10 billion to pay for drugs alone. Without HIV, AIDS patients and specialist AIDS units and their employees can rationally be absorbed into the existing infrastructure of clinics and hospitals. The pursuit of expensive drugs designed to kill HIV will be irrelevant, as will be the work of the legions of HIV researchers. The same applies to AIDS councils, the armies of AIDS educators, fundraisers, volunteers and AIDS organisations. In the US alone, there are 93,000 of the latter, one for every 4 persons ever diagnosed with AIDS.
And picking up the torch as the campaign chairman of the American Foundation for AIDS Research.
Use red? Nobody's dead.
We'll have red products, we'll have red phones.
Last year we raised over $1 million, we were very happy, and now it's grown immeasurably over the last year.
Members of the public often notice the celebrities who have suddenly and inexplicably become experts on public health. We have turned these kinds of stars into authorities on things way beyond their own training and their own knowledge.
Clear thinking. Homo sapiens, thinking man, was not named in vain. An honourable society provides unfettered information and encourages its members to make rational choices. Epidemiology shows that the development of a positive HIV antibody test in AIDS is not so much related to a given sexual practice, but rather to the frequency of passive anal intercourse in both men and women. It follows that AIDS is not a disease of sexual orientation, and as far as women are concerned, it is prudent to note that in absolute terms, innumerably more women than men engage in anal intercourse. Even so, it is not the act itself, but the very high frequency of the act which is pathogenic. As serious as public reaction to an ill-conceived retrovirus may prove, it will not be anywhere as serious as the legal backlash. There are countless individuals alive who believe they are infected with a deadly microbe, and many of them are currently treated with potentially toxic drugs with no proven benefit. They avoid intimacy, avoid having children, and sometimes avoid even casual contact with others. It would take a flotilla of poet laureates to voice the collective pain and suffering engendered by such a mistake. It would take an army of mathematically gifted lawyers to quantify, and the nation's coffers to compensate, those whose lives have been ruined by what Neville Hodgkinson has called the greatest scientific blunder of the 20th century.
It wasn't a plot, it wasn't even greed or anything like that. It was a mistake in certain circumstances that happened, but the failure has been that science failed to correct that error.
This is not to forget patients and relatives who have died at their own hands. In 1987, former US Senator Lawton Chiles of Florida told an AIDS conference of a tragic case where 22 blood donors were informed they were HIV infected on the basis of an ELISA test. 7 donors then committed suicide. In June 1998, the Swiss AIDS analyst Michael Baumgartner persuaded United Nations officials to include a dissident session at the 12th International AIDS Conference held in Geneva. Speakers include Hugh Christie, editor of Continuum magazine, AIDS analyst and documentary filmmaker Joan Shenton, epidemiologist Professor Gordon Stewart, retrovirologist and electron microscopist Professor Etienne de Haven, virologist Dr Stefan Lenker, and by satellite Eleni Papadopulos and her group from the Royal Perth Hospital. In the audience were observers from the Pasteur Institute and the US National Institutes for Health. The topic of the session was a scientific critique of the HIV antibody tests and the evidence for the existence of HIV. At the official press conference held after the meeting, Professor Bernard Herschel, chairman of the organising committee, accused the speakers of using outdated and untrustworthy scientific data. However, it was this outdated data, that of Montagnier and Gallo, that led to the 1984 proclamation that HIV is the cause of AIDS. That considered untrustworthy is the HIV experts' own data. Notwithstanding these and many other challenges to the current dogma, HIV/AIDS experts are not in the least disquieted by sceptical patients, relatives or scientists, and inveigh heavily against inquisitive journalists alleging great harm to public health. Thus it appears that the only hope for an immediate resolution of this troubled issue is to have lawyers appearing for plaintiffs who desire judgments that they are or are not infected with an AIDS-causing virus. However, even if an examination of HIV science is destined to be scrutinised by courts of law, at present one must be realistic that in the short term the status quo is extremely unlikely to change. Perhaps a disinterested observer could be forgiven for concluding that, although we are now well into the 18th year of the AIDS era and have spent many billions of dollars on treatments and research, the words of Dr. Peter Duisberg continue to taunt us. By any measure, the war on AIDS has been a colossal failure. Our leading scientists and policymakers cannot demonstrate that their efforts have saved a single life.
At least they should open up the field to people with other theories, because their own has proven to be such a resounding failure.
Perhaps the words of Eleopolis' group are of even greater portent. The single most important obstacle in finding the explanation for AIDS is the belief in HIV.
What is called AIDS is made up of 29 diseases, all of which existed long before the AIDS eras. These diseases involve fungal, mycobacterial, and other infection, producing antibodies which could react with the so-called HIV protein.
In his book, Dancing Naked in the Minefield, Dr. Carrie Mullis writes, Years from now, people will find our acceptance of the HIV theory of AIDS as silly as we find those who excommunicated Galileo. Indeed, it was Galileo who counselled, "In science, the authority embodied in the opinion of thousands is not worth a spark of reason on one man." Perhaps we should all pause, look around, and then take a long look back. Postscript. Unlike many scientific publications, the Yin and Yang essay series, which was published in 1999, has aged extremely well. However, there has of course been developments over the past 23 years. One has been the claim that modern antiretroviral therapies are working well, and this proves that HIV does exist and does cause AIDS. These claims, and others, have been dealt with in several publications by the Perth Group. I'll put links in the video description and encourage anyone wanting to take a deeper dive into the arguments to read these papers.
AIDS has both sexes running scared. Research studies now project that 1 in 5, listen to me, hard to believe, 1 in 5 heterosexuals could be dead from AIDS at the end of the next 3 years. That's by 1990.
So that we don't lose touch, please find me at drsambailey.com and sign up for my free newsletter.